On behalf of the Meredith Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you for our fourth monthly meeting and speaker series meeting. My name is John Hopper. I'm the president of the Historical Society. Tonight's program, we have a returning guest speaker who's here every time we have a meeting, but doesn't always speak, Rudy Van Vechten. Rudy's going to be talking about Ebenezer Smith, town, state, country, and country founding father. I'm sure most of you or all of you are familiar with Ebenezer Smith, at least a little bit from Rudy's first presentation, but he is unquestionably the founding father and leading citizen of the town of Meredith. So any Meredith All-Star team you put together, Ebenezer Smith is the first draft choice. Rudy, as you may also know, was a longtime editor of the Meredith News. He's also written a number of books. I don't know where he finds the time to do all this stuff, but he wrote the Sons of Liberty, Meredith and the Revolutionary War, The History of Meredith Bay, and he's a major contributor to the Society's annual publication called Morsels of Meredith History, in which shorter pieces, vignettes about Meredith history. We're trying to get these into print. They're kind of buried in newspapers or lost in oral tradition. And we're just trying to build up the historiography around the town of Meredith. So Rudy has a biography of Ebenezer that is all done except the books haven't arrived. And they were supposed to be here yesterday. They now promise we'll have them tomorrow. They will be for sale at the Historical Society. All of these books I mentioned are only available at the Historical Society. So we welcome you to stop by when you get a moment. I think you'll find it fascinating.
Or volunteer and read them when you're there.
Pardon?
Volunteer, babysit the Historical Society and you could read them when you're there.
I miss it.
Volunteer to cover the museum, then you can read it while you're there.
Yeah.
And if you volunteer often, there's several other books you can read after that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rudy, and we'll learn about Ebenezer.
Reposition things here a little bit. I'm quite as tall as John. Sure this thing is working? Yes, it is. Okay, so as I've said in my previous programs of the Historical Society, I like to type out my dialogue and read it, because otherwise I get off on so many tangents that they kick me out here about 9 or 10 o'clock. So, part one of this series on Ebenezer Smith that I presented back in April, it showed how he was the guiding light in the town's settlement and incorporation, and in the town's participation in the American Revolution. He was the one who cut the roads, who built the bridges and dragged iron up from Exeter to build the first sawmill. And most notably, he was the one who invited other hard-working pioneers to build homesteads on his land, deferring payment until they had established themselves, and then selling to them at discount prices. Tonight's talk, on the other hand, will focus on some of the contributions that Smith made on the state and federal levels, while also continuing as Meredith's leading citizen. So before I dive into Smith's work on the state level, I need to mention an unusual situation resulting from local elections in 1791. Since Meredith's incorporation 13 years earlier, Ebenezer Smith had continuously served as town clerk and leading selectman. At the April 2nd, 1781 town meeting, however, Meredith residents for the first time failed to elect Smith to those two offices. Voters instead picked John Gilman as their town clerk and also elected him along with two other men as their selectmen. But the story doesn't end there. Rather than end the town meeting that day, voters adjourned their business until 10 days later. At that reconvened meeting, the town, quote, reconsidered the vote concerning John Gilman as town clerk and voted him out, and voted Ebenezer Smith, Esquire, as town clerk. Unfortunately, there was no other similar reconsideration for the office of selectman. So Smith had a 1-year vacation from that responsibility, which was the only time in his career up until 1804 that he took 1 year off, not for his choice, I guess, but at the same time, voters in Meredith and Sanbornton had no qualms a month later electing Smith to represent them at a state constitutional convention, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So who was this John Gilman who was challenging the hegemony of Ebenezer Smith in local affairs? Well, war records show that he lived in Epping and enlisted in the Patriot Army on May 25th, 1775, so not too long after Lexington and Concord. And he entered as an ensign and rose to the rank of second lieutenant by August 1 of that year. He was back in Epping during the summer of 1776, but relocated to Meredith a few months later, purchasing the 1st Division lot of John Levitt, one of the original Meredith proprietors. This lot was located along the Province Road, which is now 106 or Parade Road, near the planned town square, and south of the lot reserved for the minister's first settled minister. It was the lot where the first official meeting house and burial ground were later located. So here you see the lot that he had purchased, and here's where the town square was supposed to be, but over here is where it ended up. And this lot here we'll be talking about a little bit later. This is the reserved for the first settled minister of the town. So when it came time for the 1782 annual town meeting, the pendulum had swung back with Smith elected both town clerk and selectman once again. Also elected to the board that year were Elias Philbrook and Isaac Farrar. So the voters had replaced all 3 of the 1781 selectmen. Apparently they didn't want to make the same mistake all over again. It appears that the cause for this hiccup in Ebenezer's long record as a town selectman resulted from factional rivalry. Oh, thank you. Seal, could you turn that back on? I need the light for mine.
Okay.
Thank you. Factional rivalry between and John Gilman, representing Federalist and anti-Federalist leanings, respectively. Federalists, generally speaking, were in favor of a strong government. Anti-Federalists felt that they had just won a revolution to get rid of a burdensome central government. So we'll see a couple more instances of this a little bit later, in a couple instances there. All right, so as we saw in the earlier program, Ebenezer Smith served as Meredith's delegate to the state government beginning at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War and continuing in the years following the war under the state constitution of 1776, which, by the way, he helped to draft. Smith was also the local delegate to a convention that began work in 1781 to build a new state constitution, which was approved in 1783 and implemented in 1784. The new blueprint of government fundamentally changed the organization of state government. For instance, there was previously no popularly elected upper chamber of the legislature, or what we now know as the Senate. Instead, members of the House of Representatives selected 12 of their number to fill that function. Well, starting with the 1784 Constitution, there was now going to be a separately elected state senate consisting of 2 individuals from each of the state's 5 counties. Also new was a provision for an executive chosen by popular vote. The office was termed president at that time, what we now know as governor. So if you hear me say governor or president, 2 of them mean the same thing. They changed it from president to government after George Washington was elected president. So they didn't want to usurp that title on themselves. Cautious about funding too much power into the hands of one person, the Constitution also provided for an executive council for advising the president in the executive part of the government. Meredith held its first state election under the new Constitution in March of 1784, a couple of weeks before the annual town meeting. Local voters for the first time faced a choice for a state president or governor and 2 Stratford County state senators as well. The vote for state senators seems to have caused some confusion among the Meredith voters, who had since the formation of the state in 1776 sent only one person to represent their interest in state matters. Records of the election show that John Wentworth of Dover, he was a cousin of the former governor of the same name, he received 35 Meredith votes for state senator. Ebenezer Smith received 34, and Joseph Badger of Gilmanton received 1. Other Stratford County towns followed suit, and when the General Court convened in Exeter that June, Ebenezer Smith was seated as one of the counties and states' first elected state senators. However, the 2-town district of Meredith and New Hampton sent no separate person to the House of Representatives because they had elected Smith to that post also, and he couldn't very well serve both. Now, also at the meeting that day, voters called for changing the day of the town meeting from the first Monday of April to the second Monday of March. And then they appointed Ebenezer Smith to be a committee for that purpose. So the bill that Senator Smith later brought to the General Court was approved in November of 1784. And 240 years later, we still hold town meeting during the second week of March, thanks to Ebenezer Smith. Realigning the day of the annual town meeting allowed Meredith to hold state and local elections at the same time. Balloting for state senators the next year, 1785, produced a surprise. John Wentworth received 53 votes, Daniel Beatty of Sandwich received 40, and Ebenezer Smith only 13. County-wide balloting resulted in John Wentworth and Otis Baker, both of Dover, winning the 2 Senate seats. State records for that year, however, list no representative for the Meredith-New Hampton 2-town district, but in the legislative journals, there are several mentions there of Ebenezer Smith that prove that he did serve as a representative during that year. But another year later, 1786 now, John Sullivan and Daniel Beatty were elected state senators, and again, no one was listed in the legislative journals for filling the representative seat for Meredith and New Hampton that year. And even though Smith once again had no trouble retaining his local offices as selectman and town clerk, he had that year off from attending sessions at the General Court. Now, there is no indication in the records what caused this interruption in Smith's service to the state. Whether it was a health issue, an issue related to his family or his homestead, it seems unlikely that it was a lack of voter support, because he easily won back his Stratford County Senate seat in the elections of March 1787. Now, pictured here is a copy of the state seal that was adopted in 1784 with the new Constitution. And I'm very curious about this, the Latin phrase, Sigillum Republicae Neo Antoniensis, which translated means the seal of the Republic of New Hampshire. And neighboring Massachusetts used a similar phrasing. And I find it interesting that these 2 pre-Constitution governments still considered themselves more as independent republics than as states in a federal union. Well, Ebenezer Smith's return to the Senate in 1787 landed him in the middle of a major controversy regarding the Smithsonian land grant of New Hampshire. This grant included all the land up to 60 miles inland from the mouth of the Piscataqua River. The question that surfaced in 1785 was whether the inland edge of the Smithsonian grant was a curved line, as previously assumed, or a straight line. And it wasn't until 1787 that the General Court began to address the issue. So here you can see the curved line that was originally assumed to be the upper limit of it. And here's the straight line here. So there's quite a bit of land in the middle here. And here you see Lake Winnipesaukee. So Meredith is in this area, which is right in the middle of the disputed land. So it's not surprising that Ebenezer Smith got interested in this issue. So. Senator Smith was a member of a committee charged to negotiate and settle with the Smithsonian proprietors regarding the land between the straight and the curved lines. A committee report dated February 13 was signed by Ebenezer Smith for the committee, which indicates to me he was probably the committee chair. While the state government was working this out, the Smithsonian proprietors down in Portsmouth were at the same time discussing their options. They appointed 2 of their number to negotiate a resolution with the General Court. And both the Senate and the House approved a measure in June of 1788, quote, that this state agreed to relinquish their claim to all the lands between the curved line, so-called, of the Smithsonian patent and a straight line as run by the committee employed by this state, provided the Smithsonian proprietors will pay the state $40,000 in state securities and $800 in specie, or give good security therefor. Well, the Smithsonian proprietors agreed with the state's offer. So they had already developed most of the land. They didn't have any reason to want to fight the issue at that point. Now, on July 28th of 1788, the proprietors hired a team that included Ebenezer Smith to assess the land. Now, isn't it interesting and significant that Ebenezer Smith, representing the government on one hand, also was trusted by the Smithsonian proprietors to assess the value of the land, put him in a pretty interesting situation. Well, talks between the parties led to the proprietors on September of 1788 agreeing to pay off the $40,000 over a 4-year period. Now, when granting townships over the years, including Meredith back in 1748, the proprietors had reserved some common lands for public purposes that they now sought to sell off to recoup the cost of the curved settlement. And not surprisingly, Ebenezer Smith ended up the beneficiary of that decision. A deed recorded in 1791 shows that Smith paid £60 to the proprietors for all the common and undivided land in the town of Meredith, with one exception. Excluded from the sale was the 200 acres that were promised over 2 decades earlier to Ebenezer's son Daniel as the first male child born in the town. So, one way or another, he got it for him and his family. So. Now, in between sessions of the state legislature, Ebenezer Smith also kept up momentum in the settlement and growth of Meredith. In the years following the Revolution, Smith increased efforts to further open up the town's 3rd division to settlement, which is largely Meredith Neck and the area right around Meredith Village. One key transaction took place in the fall of 1787 when he sold a parcel of land in the future village area to John Jennis. And it was located in the amendment lot number 20, so that's this lot right here, which is located on the southeastern corner of Lake Waukesha. Jennis paid only £15 for an estimated 40 acres, another of those transactions that Smith made favorable to the buyer. And it was also at this time that Smith engaged Jennis to develop a sawmill, referred to at the time as Colonel Smith's Mill. And it would take advantage of power from the waterfall where the Waukesha outlet drops into Lake Winnipesaukee. This was on the 3rd Division lot number 38, including its amendment lot, originally drawn to the right of James Gibson, located on both sides of the outlet stream. So that's this area right in here, where the mill lot still sits as Mill Falls Marketplace. Well, Captain William Davis acquired a 50% share of the sawmill and the water rights from Colonel Smith in 1790, and we can pretty much date the beginning of Meredith Village with the development of this new mill site, all set in motion by Ebenezer Smith. Now, during the summer of 1787, that was the year that Smith returned to the state service as a senator. The Continental Congress had invited delegates from each of the 13 states to a constitutional convention in Philadelphia. And instead of revising the former Articles of Confederation, which weren't working, they proposed an entirely new constitution to govern the United States. And once a majority of the delegates had signed the new document, they sent it out to the states for ratification. And according to Article 7 of the draft Constitution, it would take effect only after approval by 9 of the 13 states. Well, New Hampshire Governor John Sullivan wasted no time calling a special legislative session in December of 1787, and Senator Ebenezer Smith hurried down from Meredith in time for the opening of the session. Well, members quickly approved establishing a state ratifying convention, and Smith was among members appointed to a committee that proposed how the representation to the convention would take place. It would consist of the same number and distribution of delegates as in the state legislature, and that the convention would then meet on the second Wednesday of February in 1788. So legislators ordered 400 printed copies of the proposed federal constitution and sent them out to each town and city in the state with what they called precepts, calling for election of delegates to attend the February convention. And although this was to be a separate election from the election of legislative representatives and senators, in many cases, voters chose the same individuals. Well, the Meredith and New Hampton district held its election for convention delegates on February 5th of 1788. But Ebenezer Smith wasn't even there. He was in Portsmouth for the reconvened state legislature. So despite his absence, 16 of the 26 attending voters selected him to represent their interest at the ratifying convention. But like many towns in the rural frontier areas of New Hampshire, our local voting populace was decidedly opposed to the adoption, and they voted what they termed as not to receive the proposed constitution. In other words, instructing their delegate to vote against it. The problem was Colonel Smith was in favor of it, and it made a rather awkward situation. So this is another one of those situations I mentioned earlier where factionalism plays a role. The second Wednesday of February 1788 fell on the 13th, supposed to be the day after the regular legislative session was scheduled to adjourn. But as it turned out, that regular session didn't finish business on time and had to continue one extra day, causing the two bodies to overlap. Ebenezer Smith and others were stuck in Portsmouth helping close out the legislative business. And he made it over to Exeter on the 14th, the day after the ratifying convention had already begun. There is little record in the minutes regarding the nature of their discussions, other than that there was a debate respecting a religious test. They didn't agree with the fact that Catholics could actually hold office. So they didn't win out on that one, obviously. After concluding the debate and before the convention could begin general observations, a preemptive motion was made to adjourn to some future day, which was set for the third Wednesday of June in 1788. Well, delegates at that reconvened convention in June approved the state's ratification of the Constitution by a 57 to 47 vote, becoming the 9th state to do so, officially putting it into effect. Well, Ebenezer Smith did not record a vote, striking a balance between his town's opposition to the Constitution and his own inclination to strengthen the federal government. So he just abstained. Now, how this all came about is the subject of a very interesting hypothesis formulated by the late Dartmouth professor Jerry Daniel. Daniel contends that Meredith's Ebenezer Smith might well have saved the famous document from an untimely death. Well, that's a pretty astonishing claim, so let's see how he came up with that theory. Recall that the legislature was supposed to adjourn on February 12, 1788, with a ratifying convention beginning the next day. As it turned out, says Daniel, the legislature was held an extra day to complete business on an important piece of legislation, causing an overlap for many delegates. During that overlap, said Professor Daniel, a group of Constitution supporters snuck out to Exeter and succeeded in drafting operational rules for the convention. And one of the procedures that they advanced was that a motion for adjournment would take priority over any other motion. In other words, all debate would stop and they would have to vote on this motion to adjourn the meeting to a future date. Well, by the next afternoon, said Professor Daniel, all 105 delegates, including Senator Smith, were present in Exeter, and the brief pro-Constitution majority was gone. And after debating the document for a week, Daniel said, the people who were counting votes for ratification only had 45 votes. Well, if you do the math, 45 out of 105 isn't going to get the job done, and something needed to be done. Daniel cited a letter from a Federalist organizer written to historian Jeremy Belknap saying, there are 11 people who had negative instructions who came to me and said that they would be willing to vote for adjournment even though they wouldn't vote for the Constitution. And Daniel added, I've been able to identify those 11 people. There is only one person among those 11 with the stature to have pulled this all together, and that is Ebenezer Smith. Now, I know he was for the Constitution because he was listed as uncertain and doubtful despite his negative instructions. My suspicion, says Daniel, is that Ebenezer Smith was more responsible than any other person for finding out who among the negatively instructed were willing to consider adjournment. Well, newspaper reports from the time inaccurately, imagine that, a newspaper being inaccurate, they recorded that the adjournment vote was 56 to 51, or 107 in all, but there were only 105 delegates present, said Daniel, and he pointed out that the vote could have been as close as 54 to 51, which means that if two votes had gone the other way, the adjournment would have failed, and probably the Constitution would have failed along with it. Oops. Here we go. But of course it didn't fail, and by the time the convention reconvened in Concord on June 18, 1788, there was little further debate other than a committee to consider a possible Bill of Rights, a committee, by the way, in which Ebenezer Smith served. Although it looked like the Federalists had only a one-vote majority, a handful of surprise votes switched over, plus the abstentions of Smith and three others, and it made the final vote 57 to 47. So it looks like a close, but not terribly close vote in New Hampshire, says Daniel. It was, in fact, by the skin of their teeth from the very beginning. Ebenezer's vote in this was exceedingly important. I'll go out on a limb, says Daniel. I can't prove this, but I'd say if Ebenezer Smith had not been the delegate from Meredith and New Hampton, there is a good chance we would have no federal constitution today. Now, there is actually something else that I found that I would wish Jerry Daniel was still alive and I could tell him this. As he noted, the legislature was, in the winter of 1788, held over that extra day for an important piece of legislation. Well, as it turns out, one of the items addressed that extra day was the Masonian curve issue that we discussed a little bit earlier. Both the House and the Senate branches on February 13th established a committee to negotiate an agreement with the Masonian proprietors, including Ebenezer Smith. There were several other pieces of business handled that day, but this one was one that had a high level of importance, and it directly involved Ebenezer Smith. So following Daniel's example, we should ask, Was this a deliberate strategy concocted by Smith to cause the delay? Now, and you probably all thought that parliamentary tricks were a modern thing. Turns out they're as old as our country. Need a little break. Well, New Hampshire's ratification of the U.S. Constitution began the state's effort to put it into effect. And once again, Ebenezer Smith took a leading role. There were congressional representatives to elect, U.S. senators to appoint, and a vote for electors to choose the country's first president by means of an electoral college. Getting down to business in the fall of 1788, Ebenezer Smith was one of the 5 state senators on the committee that determined how U.S. representatives and presidential electors would be elected. The next step was selection of 2 U.S. senators. Now, originally, state legislatures, rather than the voters, chose the U.S. senators. New Hampshire's General Court members selected Governor John Langdon as their first Senate appointee for a 6-year term. They then selected Josiah Bartlett as the state's second U.S. senator, but after he declined the post, they settled on Payne Wingate to serve a 4-year term as the state's junior senator. The legislature then adjourned until the regular session scheduled for late December. In the interval, the state's first election for 3 congressional representatives took place on Monday, December 15th. And after some complications, Samuel Livermore, who lived in Holderness, by the way, Nicholas Gilman, and Abiel Foster won the state's 3 congressional seats. Now, selection of presidential electors was equally complicated, and Ebenezer Smith's role in sorting it out was doubly so. Not only was he in charge of steering the state Senate through the process, he also received votes in the election. So it took a committee several days to sort it all out, and on January 6th of 1789, the committee reported that no one had received the requisite number of votes, triggering a legislative runoff selection process from among those who received the top 10 most votes. Ebenezer Smith was 9th in the tally with 543 votes. Well, after rejecting several methods for making a final selection, both houses eventually came to agreement on perhaps the simplest solution by awarding the elector slots to the top 5 in the tally list. In the end, it didn't make much difference anyway, because all the electors from all of the states all unanimously voted for George Washington as our first president. Now, to backtrack a few months, Ebenezer Smith had taken on additional duties in the state government after he was elected state senator in 1784 and again in 1787. And another new challenge for 1 year only came in 1788. As recorded in the Senate Journal on June 6th, the ballots being taken, it appeared that the Honorable Ebenezer Smith, Esquire, was chosen a counselor. So he, for 1 year, was a member of the State Executive Council. Now, adoption of the U.S. Constitution, with that adoption, some of the New Hampshire's top leaders would be leaving the state to tend to national business. This resulted in a reshuffling in the local ranks, such as when John Langdon resigned his position as governor in order to serve as U.S. Senator. Now, as spelled out in the state constitution, this meant that the senior senator, who then was John Pickering, moved up to the governor's position. It seems that there was no constitutional provision for replacing Pickering as senior senator, and he apparently continued in both functions. He served in the role of interim governor until a new slate of elected officials took over in June of 1789. And at that point, John Sullivan, the Revolutionary War general, was elected as governor of the state. Pickering, as a result, returned to the state Senate as senior senator. And Pickering also replaced Ebenezer Smith on the governor's council for that year. Meanwhile, senior Senator John Pickering had been nominated as Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. And the previous Chief Justice was Samuel Livermore, the gentleman from Holderness. In preparation for possibly accepting the post, he provided for his replacement as the head of the New Hampshire Senate. And as recorded in the Senate Journal for January 15, 1790, it was voted that Ebenezer Smith, Esquire, be the senior senator. So he moved up to the top rank of the state Senate. Now, in the election of 1790, Meredith and New Hampton once again elected Ebenezer Smith as their choice for the House of Representatives. But the legislature again elevated Smith as a senator instead, leaving Meredith, New Hampton again with nobody in the lower chamber. Now, when the new legislature convened in June 4th of 1790, Smith again accepted the office as senior senator. And that is what we now call the Senate President. This, in effect, meant that he was the deputy governor, because that office doesn't exist in the state of New Hampshire. So he was number 2 in the whole state of New Hampshire, just below Governor Josiah Bartlett. So on this slide, I picked out some issues addressed while Ebenezer Smith was senior senator. One important task was presiding over the 1790 to 91 impeachment trial of Superior Court Judge Woodbury Langdon. And he was the brother of Revolutionary notable and former New Hampshire Governor John Langdon. Provisions for impeachment spelled out in the 1784 Constitution dictated that all impeachments would be made by the House of Representatives and tried by the state Senate. In its 3 articles of impeachment in the summer of 1790, the House alleged that Langdon had neglected to attend to his judicial duties, and I'll quote, by means whereof the state courts had not been holden at the times and places by law established, and the administration of justice delayed, to great injury of the good citizens of the state. Well, Langdon was allowed several months to prepare his defense, but when the trial resumed in Concord in January of 1791, Langdon failed to appear, whereupon ordered, says the order, that a summons signed by the senior senator be issued to the sheriff of the county of Rockingham, commanding him to summon Woodbury Langdon before the Senate on Tuesday, the 25th of January. Well, during the intervening months, it turns out, Langdon had submitted his resignation as Superior Court judge in order to accept a federal-level job in the administration of President Washington. Although the House chafed at the loss of opportunity to, just like today, to embarrass a political opponent, the Senate in February 1791, led by Ebenezer Smith, opted to accept Langdon's resignation and dismissed the trial. Now, another key issue during this term was mail distribution, which was one of the infrastructure segments that American governments had to rebuild following Great Britain's exit. This issue was high up on the agenda as the General Court reconvened in January of 1791, and Ebenezer Smith jumped right into the fray as part of a joint legislative committee established to consider the propriety of establishing post roads and post riders. Reporting back on February 5th, the committee recommended 4 postal routes. And route number 4 was the one covering our area. It ran from Portsmouth to Dover and continued up to Rochester, Wakefield, Ospey, Tamworth, and Samworth, and then down Bean Road to Center Harbor, and up over Route 25B, which they called the College Road, to Plymouth, then south again on the Province Road and back down to Portsmouth. Riders were required to ride the route once a week, reversing direction each time. Well, with postal routes and fees established, it was now up to the President and Council to nominate and appoint post riders and postmasters. And among these appointments on March 17 and 18 was Moses Center Jr. of Meredith for post rider on the 4th route. Well, as it turned out, Center declined the offer, And instead, Ebenezer Cram of Pittsfield won the appointment. And in addition to his involvement in state matters, senior Senator Ebenezer Smith was still head selectman in his hometown of Meredith. And not surprisingly, a number of actions that he ushered through the Senate had implications back home. And among the bills approved were some that you would expect would come out of the legislature, like an act for laying out highways, and an act for regulating towns and choosing town officers, and an act for establishing an equitable method of making taxes and for ascertaining the powers of selectmen. But there are also a few of kind of social engineering type of things. So, such as an act for the punishment of profane cursing and swearing. Well, I think they would have sent me right into the stocks with that one. An act for punishment of idle and disorderly persons. An act for punishment of lewdness, adultery, and polygamy. And an act to prevent incestuous marriages and to regulate divorces. A little bit more strict back then, I guess, than they are now. So. Well, voter confusion continued at local elections, and Meredith once again favored Ebenezer Smith as both senator and representative for the 1791 to 92 years. This time, however, the voters across Stratford County elected 2 other state senators outright. And as a result, former senior Senator Smith returned to being Representative Smith and took a seat in the larger House representing Meredith and New Hampton. Among other talents, Smith had built a reputation for surveying and road building, and this undoubtedly led to his participation during that year on a joint legislative committee tasked with laying out a road from Conway to Shelburne, quite a ways away from Meredith, but the next time you drive up between Mount Washington and Wildcat, tip your hat to Ebenezer Smith for laying out the road. Annual elections in March of 1792 once again found no individual receiving a majority of votes for Stratford County, and Smith received the highest number with 655 votes and moved to another runoff with 3 other candidates. And when the new legislature convened in June, it was Smith and John Waldron chosen to represent the county in the New Hampshire State Senate. While other members of the Senate jumped at the opportunity to have their former leader back with them again and quickly moved him back into the seat as senior senator. Well, George Washington's first term as U.S. president was coming to an end, and in November of 1792, it was once again time to vote for electors for the country's second presidential election. New Hampshire's quota of electors increased from 5 to 6 after the census of 1790. And when no one received the necessary number of votes to win the election outright, the 12 who received the highest number competed in a runoff conducted by the legislature. Ebenezer Smith had received the 10th most votes this time, and he was not among the 6 who were selected to return President Washington to office for his second term. Although Smith's resignation as colonel several years earlier had seemingly marked the end of his military career, his past service was recognized one more time. On February 7, 1793, Governor Bartlett and his executive council needed to appoint a new major general for the state's ongoing militia administration. Councilors advanced only 2 nominees, Brigadier General Moses Dow of Haverhill and Colonel Ebenezer Smith of Meredith. Well, Dow was the more qualified of the 2, and he won the post. But Smith's nomination to the post most likely stemmed from the efforts that he had made in improving the New Hampshire militia, which has an interesting tie-in to today's ongoing discussions about the Second Amendment. So, ratification of the Constitution in 1788 came with the suggestions from several states, including New Hampshire, for amendments guaranteeing various rights and liberties. These suggestions went into formulation into the 1791 Bill of Rights, And amendment number 2 is the much debated right to bear arms amendment. Focus is largely placed on the second clause of the amendment, that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But it is the first clause of the amendment that provides the historical context, and that is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Now, there were 2 main issues. During the Revolution, General George Washington discovered that local militia units were undisciplined and poorly organized. He hired Baron Friedrich von Steuben to improve and standardize training routines during the winter at Valley Forge. And the second issue, as the young United States struggled through the years following the Revolution, citizens maintained a great distrust over maintenance of a full-time standing army. And in the absence of a professional army, it was important to continue relying on local militias. So even before adoption of the Bill of Rights, New Hampshire's legislature was discussing this issue. A report signed by Ebenezer Smith in February of 1785 recommended, quote, that the exercise to be used in the several regiments of militia in the state be that which is commonly called Baron Steuben's, and lately published and used in the Continental Army. Well, the legislature followed his recommendations by ordering 1,500 copies of Baron von Steuben's training system to be printed and distributed among the state's militia officers. Now, adoption of the Second Amendment and the Bill of Rights put added emphasis on the militia structure. Governor Josiah Bartlett told the New Hampshire legislature, "The business that more immediately requires the attention of the legislature is the arrangement of the militia and making the laws of this state conformable to the law of the general government for regulating the militia." So notice the word that he uses, regulating. The same root word is used in the Second Amendment, well regulated. So that same day, Ebenezer Smith joined a committee of senators and representatives to study the matter and to make recommendations. After debate and some failed amendments, the House on December 18th and the Senate on December 28th approved an act for forming and regulating the militia within the state and for repealing all the laws heretofore made for that purpose. So Ebenezer Smith's leadership had helped bring New Hampshire's into conformity with the Second Amendment's goal of maintaining a well-regulated militia. All right, so despite all the important time-consuming work that he was doing for the state, Ebenezer Smith rarely left local matters in Meredith entirely to others. In between legislative sessions, he made the long trip north to tend to matters at home, and in one case, however, it didn't work out. 2 important issues spanning over many years were, 1, the building of a meeting house, which would be a facility for both civic and religious meetings, and 2, obtaining an official settled congregational minister for the town. Now, Masonian rules in the granting of the town specified that local taxes should pay for a meeting house as well as an official minister. And the Puritan majority in town was unwilling to make Baptist minister Nicholas Folsom as their settled minister. They instead wanted a proper college-educated congregational pastor guiding their spiritual affairs. Well, the town did finally build a meeting house, a combination town hall and church, at the bend in the Province Road near present-day Pickle Pond Road. And in a few years, the town hosted its first town meeting in the new building, and it was August 30th, 1790. Their next order of business was filling the pulpit in the church. So on December 10th, 1791, and this is important, when Ebenezer Smith was conveniently out of town tending to state business, then the town's other 2 selectmen posted a warrant for voters to gather at the meeting house to see if the town will vote to give the Reverend Simon Finley Williams a call to settle in the ministry of said town, and to see what encouragement they will vote to give said Mr. Williams for settling as the town minister. Now, it is curious that residents chose to hold such an important meeting when Ebenezer Smith was absent, which leans toward the possibility that it was a deliberate choice designed to avoid having him voice an opposing point of view. With Smith absent, voters agreed to hire the Reverend Mr. Williams, promising to provide him a 2-story house on the minister's lot and to pay him an annual salary of £60. You'll like this. 1/3 was going to be in cash, 1/3 in grain, and 1/3 in meat. Simon Finley Williams studied divinity at Dartmouth, graduating in 1785. He was subsequently ordained as pastor of the Congregational Church of Methuen, Massachusetts, for about 5 years, but he was dismissed for unspecified reasons. Now jobless and with a young family, it's easy to see how the call to become Meredith's official settled minister appealed to Williams, and he eagerly accepted the job. Well, Ebenezer Smith learned all this when he returned home from state matters, and he had to attend to some damage control. His friend and fellow veteran Baptist preacher Nicholas Carr Folsom had had use of the lot of land that was reserved for the use of the town's first minister. Folsom now had to get off that property in order to have them build the house for Reverend Simon Finley Williams. It was still a couple of months before Williams and his family were received into full communication to the church. The next order of business was planning the November 28th ceremony to officially install the minister. Payne Smith, Ebenezer's brother, was on the planning committee, and Ebenezer chipped in with 2 gallons of molasses, some meat, plus a gallon of wine and a gallon of rum. So, sounds like a nice religious observance going place. But all was not well. After 5 years serving the Meredith Church, charges were leveled against their pastor at a meeting of the church on March 2nd of 1797. That his conduct was not, nor had been agreeable to the gospel. Now, when Pastor Williams asked the church for permission to resign, members refused to act on the request immediately. As you see, as the town's settled minister, it was a decision for the whole town, not just the minister's own congregation. So at a meeting of the church a few weeks later, members named Joseph Roberts and Ebenezer Smith, quote, to inquire into the conduct of Simon F. Williams in regard to a number of stories reported about him, not becoming or agreeable to a minister of the gospel. Well, results of the investigation are not divulged, but it resulted in the church and the town voting, quote, that the pastoral relation between the Reverend Simon F. Williams and this church be dissolved due to the minister's unchristian conduct. And it wasn't just a simple dismissal as with the Methuen church some years before. It was more of a local excommunication. It was a black mark on the minister's reputation that jeopardized the possibility of his ever obtaining a similar ministerial position in another church. Must have been a pretty serious thing that he was charged with. Well, following his departure from Meredith, Simon Williams signed on to the crew of a naval frigate, the USS Essex, which, by the way, was a sister ship to the USS Constitution. Williams' Dartmouth alumni biography notes that he joined the ship not as a chaplain, but as the ship's steward. And quoting from that biographical sketch, the ship touched at Batavia, which is now Jakarta, Indonesia, in the summer of 1800, and his former position as a minister having been ascertained, he was appointed to deliver an oration on the vessel's deck during the 4th of July. But he got a fever and died on July 3rd. So he never made it to give that funeral, that oration. Now, whether it was a coincidence or more specifically related to William's transgressions. Nicholas Carr Folsom's Baptist congregation, during these same years, April 1797, they drafted paperwork to file with the state for incorporation. And in the petition signed by 59 members of the local Baptist society, the worshipers noted that they had built their own meeting house and ordained an elder as their minister. Incorporation, they said, would give the church full power to transact their own matters. And I just want to show here, this is a copy of an old map that was published in 1784, but it was actually surveyed before the Revolution in 1774. And right here you see the church depicted on the map. Whether that's an accurate location is hard to say. But just for perspective, this is the Province Road, or Route 106 going down through here. And this area that's marked as the Shad Path, that's where Pedal Pushers is now located, down on the Parade Road. Now, local legislative procedure for such incorporation requests was to determine if there were any community objections. To determine this, town voters were asked to address the Baptist petition. Town meeting records on file with Carrie Parker, our town clerk, down at Town Hall, show that the residents at the meeting, quote, voted that they would oppose the petition of the Baptists. State records, however, record the vote differently, saying that they would not oppose the petition of the Baptist Society. Now, both records can't be right. One of them's got to be wrong. Well, in addition to considering the town meeting vote, the House and Senate also received a separate statement signed by 12 Meredith residents, including Ebenezer Smith, saying that the undersigned have no objections to the prayer of the within petition. So, how can we rationalize what's going on here? I can see a couple of key possibilities for this discrepancy. One, town clerk Daniel Smith, who might have been Ebenezer's son, but not certainly, he mistakenly omitted the intended word not from his minutes of the meeting. So an unintentional error. But he included it in the version provided to the legislature. And remember, there were no photocopiers at the time, so every copy had to be handwritten, in which case, every time you handwrite something, you could make a mistake all over again, or a new mistake. So. Another possibility is that the Depression-era WPA worker who transcribed and typed the town records back in the 1930s mistakenly changed not oppose to oppose, thereby reversing the intended meaning of it. Either one of these would have been an honest mistake that any of us could have made. I've made worse mistakes myself. But there is another possibility to consider. Ebenezer Smith, as Meredith's principal delegate to the state government, would have been the one to file the bill in the legislature for that incorporation. So did he deliberately alter the wording to the opposite of what town meeting had voted? Well, there's some circumstantial evidence favoring that possibility. Ebenezer Smith had previously supported Nicholas Carr Folsom's Baptist ministry. And then Smith was one of those 12 Meredith residents to sign the separate document stating that they had no objection to the Baptist incorporation. Now, such a statement was not even necessary if the town had voted as a whole that it was not opposed to the incorporation. And third, this was the last time that Ebenezer Smith won local election as the town's representative in state government. That year he lost the election as state senator to Nathan Hoyt. And instead he served half of the year in the House of Representatives, but was replaced in August with the election of Richard Boynton. Smith did, however, to his own credit, continue to be elected town selectman for several more years. So, was this another example of local factionalism? Did Ebenezer Smith tamper with the town records in transmitting them to the state to win approval for the Baptist incorporation? Well, if so, it worked. The legislature approved the incorporation in December of 1797. Now, as if Ebenezer Smith didn't have enough to do, being top senator in the state government and head selectman in his own town, he also remained an influential property owner in neighboring Gilmanton. And when residents there began discussing the possibility of operating an institution of higher education, Colonel Smith was included in the planning. On August 27, 1792, Ebenezer Smith was among those appointed to take charge of the school right or property and open a subscription for the benefit of said academy and to petition the general court for an act of incorporation. Here we go, another act of incorporation here. Now, the incorporation papers won state approval in June of 1794, with the institution controlled by a board of 10 trustees, including Ebenezer Smith. The trustees held their first meeting on September 23rd, at which Ebenezer Smith of Meredith was named treasurer. He continued to serve on the Gilmanton Academy Board for the next 12 years. And according to Daniel Lancaster's History of Gilmanton, in 1806, on October 7th, Colonel Daniel Smith was appointed to the vacancy made by the resignation of his father, the Honorable Ebenezer Smith. So he served right up into 1806, 1 year before his death. Smith also played a role in the development of a section of Gilmanton known first as the Upper Parish and later as Gunstock Parish, which is now Guilford. When the Gilmanton proprietors back in 1761 had laid out that section, Ebenezer Smith and his brother Payne Smith were among subscribers posting bonds for developing the lots. Ebenezer maintained an interest in that section for the remainder of his life. The northeastern point of the Gunstock Parish was opposite the section of Meredith known then and now as the Weirs. As time went on, it became desirable to connect the two sides with a bridge. And on May 10th of 1780, Gilmanton made arrangements for a bridge over the river at the Weirs. That's what they called the Weirs. They called it Weirs. And clearing the main road from said bridge to the first parish. And that Ebenezer Smith be the agent to sell said lots, and that the mill privilege be given to the people in that part of the town forever. Well, Smith was also involved in another bridge project in 1782. At the annual Gilmanton Town meeting on the 14th of March, it was agreed that Colonel Ebenezer Smith should be called upon to build half of the bridge over the Winnipesaukee River above Abraham Folson's Mills. Well, we know this now as the Elm Street Bridge in Lakeport. Now, a more involved contribution to Gilmanton came in the late 1780s when there was a push for development in the town's Gunstock Parish. On November 29th of 1788, quote, permission was given to Simeon Hoyt and Ebenezer Smith to erect a mill or mills on Gunstock Brook for the space of 15 years, and to clear on each side of the brook 2 acres for the benefit of the mill yard. Well, Smith and Hoyt had these mills up and running in 1789 in what we now know as Guilford Village. On request, writes Gilmanton historian Lancaster, liberty was given to the people of Gunstock Parish to saw lumber for their meeting house at the mill of Simeon Hoyt and Ebenezer Smith, agreeably to the conditions on which said mills were built. Well, just one more now. On this slide, we see images of Ebenezer Smith's gravestone located in the Washington Smith or Round Bay Cemetery, which is located just north of the site of Ebenezer's homestead on Lake Opeechee. Following his death in August of 1807, Ebenezer Smith's estate was divided up among his surviving children. He had 4 sons and 4 surviving daughters. Some of Ebenezer Smith's descendants continue to live in the area to this day. One is Merrill Fay, owner of Fay's Boatyard in Guilford. Another is Noah Gray, who you might have heard of. He's a tight end with the 2023 and 24 Super Bowl champion Kansas City Royals. Ebenezer Smith's lasting legacy to us all lies equally in the past, present, and the future of the Lakes Region towns that he helped found and flourish. And they include Gilmanton, Guilford, Laconia, and of course Meredith, with additional involvement in the towns of Sanbornton, New Hampton, Center Harbor, and Moultonborough. And although Smith had political disagreements with some of his fellow townsfolk, his reputation for fairness and support of early settlers, especially veterans, won out and earned him an appropriate nickname, the Father of the Town. Well, it seems the first published usage of this phrase came in 1845 with Daniel Lancaster's History of Gilmanton, where he writes, Judge Smith was the father to the new settlers of the town for many years. But next comes the editor of the New Hampshire State Papers in 1893, and he writes, he was the father of his townsmen and delighted in their prosperity, and to him they were much indebted for their welfare. And then Lena Smith Ford, in a brief biography of her ancestor published about 1955, she terms it somewhat differently. It was his custom to settle poor men on some of his land, financing them until they were able to go along independently. And in this way, he became known as the father of the poor man. Well, looking at the broader picture, we should give equal significance to Ebenezer Smith's contribution to the basic civil structure of the state of New Hampshire. And as we look forward to the 250th birthday of our nation, which occurs 2 years from this Thursday, we can especially celebrate the efforts he made in securing both the independence and the Constitution of the United States of America. He was, as I hint in the title of my new Ebenezer Smith biography, he was Meredith's prime mover. Thank you. I don't see anybody trying to kick us out yet, so if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer. Try to answer them if anybody has any. Yes?
Where was the Gilmanton Baptist Church located that he built?
The church, it was probably in the village near that Gunstock Brook. They were building up things pretty much near that mill, and that would be awfully convenient. And you didn't have to bring that lumber very far from the mill to build a church. That stream runs from that area where Guilford Village is down and empties into Smith Cove, which is named for Ebenezer Smith. And that's where Faye's Marina is. Anyone else? Okay, thank you.